second. This will be exciting. It's our third session of this series on origins of the COVID virus. If you've missed anything, if this is the first time you've been, you didn't get to the previous session, you can watch replays of them so you can get caught up quite easily. And we've had lots of questions both the other times, so please be willing to ask questions today, and we'll probably hold them to the end. So if you wouldn't mind, just put them into the question box, and then at the end we'll get to them. But ask them; they're awesome. There's never a bad question. Every question is awesome. So, Jonathan, we're open now. We start in about 3 minutes, but we're in a warm-up mode, a little bit like television shows have, where people can watch what we're doing before we get ready to go.
Yep. Well, I'm ready when you are.
So Mark's behind the glass, everybody. Arif, are you there, Arif?
Yep, I'm here. Hey, Jonathan.
Doing a bunch of
Hi, Arif.
today.
How are you?
All right.
Thank you.
So just a little bit of next week's stuff. We've got a little fewer webinars next week. This week we had 4, I believe. Next week we have 2. One on Monday with a lady that I think you're going to greatly enjoy. And then I'm doing mine on Tuesday. And I think that's it for the week, right, Fareed?
Yep, that's it for this next one.
But I had a really cool email today with Joel Salatin. If you guys are anything into restorative, regenerative lifestyle, agriculture, probably not much question that Joel Salatin is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. Anybody in that area, he is off the chart speaker. He gets usually $8,000 a day for speaking appearances. I've had the great fortune of speaking on a couple of panels with him, but people come to the panel to hear him, not anybody else. I've been at a couple of different events where he had 5,000 people that were there just to see him speak. Anyway, there's a possibility, don't count on it exactly yet, but that he's going to come and do a webinar for us. He and I are good friends and kind of asked him a favor, so we'll see.
He is a good speaker. I saw him at Cornell. Yeah.
At what?
I saw him at Cornell.
What was the event you saw him at?
Well, he just came to give a one-off presentation.
Oh, at Cornell. Okay.
Yeah. But it was interesting because it was the philosophy department that invited him. Like, there's no way, I don't think that the ag school would invite him. And so that's how it transpired.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. No, he is he's not a real he's not thought real highly of by Monsanto or Cargill or those other companies.
Yeah, that's right. So that means that you don't get to speak.
He has made he has had huge success. Yeah, we're fine, Mark. That's all right. All right, let's go ahead and get started, Mark. All right, hey everybody. This is Wayne and Mark and Arif and our very special guest, Jonathan, who's so kind to be here for the 3rd time with us with this incredible topic of really the origins of the coronavirus, of the COVID virus. And he's spoken for 2 weeks previous. If you missed either of those times, you can get those. We have replays on all of them. You are all members of the EAT community, which is the host of this event. And you can go just in your website and watch those webinars. However, you can also get a hold of Mark or Arif or myself, and we can also help you get access to them. So I didn't ask Jonathan earlier, how long about is your presentation today? I had several questions for you. If we have a little bit of time to just do a little bit of introduction.
Yeah, you know, I think about 45 minutes. I typed it out and it'll be about that. Yeah, but I didn't time it super accurately.
Okay. All right. Well, it gives us 5 minutes or so. So this is sort of, I call this a lightning round of questions. Just whatever comes to your mind first about the questions I'm going to ask, answer them that way. So first one, what's a tool, any kind of a tool that you handle in your hands, a tool with the internet, you name it, that you've used in the last 6 months, let's say, that is just really cool and you'd love to tell people about it?
I don't use too many, you know. I sit around at home and I do, you know, I basically use the same things and I never innovate in that direction, hardly at all. You know, I mean, I haven't bought any tools. I haven't, you know, I don't buy software. I don't buy gadgets. The closest thing I get to do is buying things like kitchen knives for cooking and stuff. So we managed to find one vegetable peeler.
That's one. That's a great tool.
That works pretty good. But
There
it's
we
not
go.
easy to find a good vegetable peeler. That's a hard question for me.
All right. No, that's a good one. What person other than your parents had huge influence over you when you were in your teens?
You know, I had a godfather who used to send me books, like interesting books. As president, I had a very narrow upbringing, and he used to send me these really interesting books by, like, you know, radical explorers or people, you know, left-wing people or right-wing people or whatever. That were like, you know, I don't even know how much he read them. They didn't mirror his interest, as far as I know, but that made a huge difference to me.
Awesome. Well, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Tell us about something that's happened in your life that when it occurred, it seemed like it was just horrible. And then when you look back on it now, it actually was, it was for the good. It created something good. So some kind of an event.
Well, you know, a pretty big one was I went to India for 3 months and I had a fairly miserable time. I was ill for most of it. And ended up, we went home a little bit early just because we were just so exhausted and tired of being ill. But, you know, when India, you realize that there are other civilizations out there that nobody had ever really told you about or, you know, given much respect to in your own culture that were equally as interesting as my own. You know, they had yoga and philosophy and a whole set of spiritual values and a whole set of attitudes to life, and I came back, you know, understanding that the Western world was a very narrow place in general, and so that was a totally transforming experience, but it wasn't not fun.
Well, and you realize that later. Last question, and then we'll go ahead and go to your presentation. Give us a person in your life that was really kind of either a partner, so they worked very close to you in either a project or an endeavor, something. You don't need to say their name. If you'd like to, you can. But tell us just a little bit about them and why they were so special to you.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, science is a very solitary profession. Intellectual life is a very solitary profession. But, you know, my partner, you know, right now, I mean, I wouldn't do any of the work that I do now if it wasn't for my partner. You know, she is totally supportive
Okay.
of everything that I do. So that's the big one for me.
Awesome. Well, that's it for me. Everybody, put your thinking hats on and put your typing fingers together and put some questions out there so that when Jonathan's done, we can answer them. I'm going to actually mute my webcam so I don't distract. And Jonathan, it's all yours.
So I can just present from here. Is that right? We don't have the screen isn't big. Okay, right. Let me know if this is the problem. So in the previous two talks in this series.
Oh, this is fine. You're seeing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Wayne. So, well, I forgot to say greetings, everybody, and thank you for people who are coming back, and welcome to new people. So thank you, Wayne, for that introduction too. So in the previous two talks in this series, I outlined our current understanding of the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic virus. In the first talk, I suggested three general conclusions. One of these was that there is currently virtually no evidence in favor of a zoonotic origin of SARS-CoV-2, which I will call SARS-2. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence, which I summarized, pointing to a lab escape from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This evidence implicates, in particular, the coronavirus sample collection and the coronavirus research led there by Dr. Zhengli Shi. In the second talk, I summarized the leading lab origin theories. Mostly, I described the Mojang minus passage theory, which is based primarily on the findings of a master's thesis that we arranged to have translated from Chinese. This thesis describes how, in 2012, 6 miners became sick with COVID-like symptoms and 3 died in what was a suspected novel coronavirus outbreak. The Mojang minus passage theory proposes that the SARS-2 virus evolved inside one of the miners, and we know that samples taken from them went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which I'll be calling the WIP. It was research on these samples, we propose, that accidentally started the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019. The theory neatly explains all of the principal medical and genealogical mysteries of the SARS-2 virus. It explains why the virus attacks the lungs. Plus, it also explains why the virus has barely evolved since the outbreak began. And of course, it explains why the epicenter was Wuhan. In today's talk, my intention is to cast the net wider and ask questions that normally never get asked about the geopolitical context of the pandemic. What I will suggest is that there is such a thing as a pandemic virus industrial complex. This complex is not a conspiracy. Rather, like the military industrial complex, it is an interlocking set of corporations and other institutions who feed off and support each other with goods and services in a self-reinforcing way. It is an enterprise that seeks to milk public money and leverage it into private profit. It runs on your tax dollars. What is interesting and surprising is not so much that a version of the military-industrial complex would arise in the medical health sphere. It is rather that many of the participants play unexpected roles. Philanthropies are string pullers and profit centers. The Defense Department is a cash cow, but also a provocateur. Academia provides public relations, whereas nonprofits are the money launderers. These non-traditional roles are intended to confuse and camouflage the various moving parts of what is anyway a complex situation, thereby protecting the whole from scrutiny. There is therefore an important difference between the pandemic virus industrial complex and the military industrial complex. The pandemic virus industrial complex is public-facing and expected to be beneficial and transparent, whereas the military industrial complex does not really have to cope with these demands. It has no image to speak of that needs to be maintained, and it doesn't interact with organizations that themselves are sensitive to reputational damage. This requirement is in large part the explanation for these institutional complexities and non-traditional roles, academics providing PR, etc. They exist because a complex illusion has to be maintained. What I will propose is that the pandemic virus industrial complex has played a decisive, so far at least, role in deflecting and obscuring the likely pandemic origins. Its existence explains why the mainstream media has barely discussed the evidence I have previously described to you. But it is also the missing political framework for the pandemic. In 2014, as many of you will recall, a major Ebola virus outbreak in Sierra Leone and neighboring West African countries killed nearly 11,000 people and set off international fears that bordered initially on panic. The standard account of the cause of this outbreak can be found in the scientific literature. It is based on an investigation led by researcher Fabian Leendertz of the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. Leendertz and his colleagues concluded that a child called Emil Uamunu from Miliandu village in Guinea was playing in a tree with bats in 2013. He caught the disease from these bats and thereby constituted patient zero of a zoonotic outbreak. As this slide shows, the Leendertz paper draws this conclusion emphatically. The opening statement of the paper reads, "The severe Ebola virus disease epidemic occurring in West Africa stems from a single zoonotic transmission event to a 2-year-old boy in Miliandu, Guinea." This scientific conclusion became a global media sensation. This slide shows the Atlantic magazine, the BBC, and the UK Independent, together with at bottom right, the photo of the tree that Emil supposedly played in. But in West Africa at that time, stories abounded that the disease came from the Kanima Hospital in Sierra Leone. This hospital housed a laboratory that was studying Lassa virus, which is a virus related to Ebola. This lab was largely funded by the US Defense Department, but importantly, according to the Sierra Leone Ministry of Health, the lab was also testing Ebola virus in ways that are unclear. The principal explanation for US funding of a lab in Sierra Leone was the then recent upgrading of Lassa fever virus to a Category A pathogen by the US CDC. Category A is reserved for pathogens of potential value to terrorists. This designation led to at least $40 million in US biodefense dollars being funneled into the creation of the Lassa fever program at Kanima. The work was carried out under the auspices of a group called the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. Led by Harvard University, this consortium also included Tulane University, Scripps Research Institute, the University of California, San Diego, the Broad Institute of Boston, the University of Texas Medical Branch, and various companies. Autoimmune Technologies, LLC, Corgenix Medical Corporation, Zalgen, and another called Metabiota. Although the work at the Kanima lab was intrinsically dangerous, it is not clear that the necessary safety precautions were in place. As a Zalgen researcher told Reuters, "Certainly we have less safety, less containment, but we do have the ability to do a lot more in the same amount of time." In other words, some researchers were apparently there to take advantage of lower biosecurity standards. The journalist Cherno Bar traveled in West Africa investigating the stories that the outbreak began at Kanima Hospital. Interviewing the family of Emil Uamunu, for his book, The Ebola Outbreak in West Africa. Barr found that Emil died at 18 months old, probably too young to be playing with bats. Moreover, Emil was never diagnosed with Ebola virus, and nor was anyone closely associated with him. In fact, the nearest confirmed case of Ebola happened in Guinea, elsewhere, on February 28, 2014, 3 months after Emil died. There are other major gaps in the Linda story. Whereas previous Ebola outbreaks were associated with mass die-offs of animals before the virus jumped to humans, the 2014 outbreak was not. Additionally, the team Linda assembled killed and surveyed bats and other animals at Meliandu and nearby looking for Ebola virus, but no trace of Ebola was ever found. And lastly, the Linda's paper never formally claims that Emil played in the tree, only that other children did. In other words, despite its ultra-confident opening that Emil was patient zero, the paper provides no evidence to support the claim. Moreover, the international charity Médecins Sans Frontières later wrote up a report on the outbreak. The MSF report found that, although the official narrative placed the origin with Emil in Guinea, email communications with viral hemorrhagic fever consortium members placed the likely origin in eastern Sierra Leone, i.e. near to the Kanema hospital. MSF's report also concluded that Ebola surveillance at the Kanema hospital was in a disastrous state. Whereas Emil was claimed to have Ebola on the flimsiest of evidence, at Kanema, experts there were failing to report obvious Ebola cases to MSF or to the government of Sierra Leone. Finally, and certainly not least, the 2014 epidemic strain of Ebola most closely resembles the Zaire strain, up to then only found in Gabon and Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, over 3,000 kilometers and 5,000 kilometers away, respectively. All told, it is hardly surprising that Chernobyl speculated that the outbreak might have started at the Kanema Hospital Research Lab. It would certainly be interesting to know what strain of Ebola was being tested at Kanema. Yet no lab investigation ever occurred. What lessons does this story provide that can be of use to us in this current pandemic? First, it suggests that lab escapes may be more common than we think. What are widely considered zoonotic outbreaks may not be at all. And for another example of this, I would highly recommend Edward Hooper's book, The River, about the origins of AIDS and HIV. The second useful analysis we can apply to this event is to follow the money. The first thing to notice is that it is government money, in this case mostly US defense dollars, that finance the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium's research and development in Africa. For other projects that constitute the pandemic virus industrial complex, the money may alternatively derive from aid dollars or health dollars, depending. Thirdly, consortium members like Cogenics and Metabiota have a specific business model in mind. But the model is not directed at protecting Africans from Lassa or Ebola. At the time of the Ebola outbreak, Sierra Leone had only 95 physicians in the whole country. That is not a market. Rather, the business model is to sell either vaccines or pharmaceutical treatments or diagnostic to the US or European military. Mindful that the Pentagon once wrote an $877 million check for an anthrax vaccine. But the treatment for an Ebola virus or a Lassa fever is for the small fry, relative to potential global pandemic agents, such as the coronavirus studied at the WIV. Ebola is high risk and low reward, which is why the members of the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium are small companies. Fourth, Despite the boy who played with bats account being scientifically unsupported, it has become the conventional academic explanation of the 2014 Ebola outbreak. The success of that narrative suggests an alarming deficiency of academic skepticism in the zoonotic origins community. The scientists are failing in their primary academic role of generating knowledge and understanding. Instead, more and more frequently, academia creates fictions, convenient, self-serving narratives. Whether the 2014 Ebola outbreak was truly a lab escape cannot be assessed without a thorough and unbiased investigation, which never happened. However, locating the start of the outbreak seemingly in Guinea helped diffuse the popular suspicion of one. And fifth, as we saw, the boy in the tree story became a global media narrative. But anyone reading Nerlene Dirt's Ebola Origins paper can hardly fail to notice that it doesn't at all support the bold statement with which it opens. In fact, the failure to find Ebola in the bats or any other sample animals in Meliandou suggests precisely that the outbreak did not start there. But in microcosm, this is the media's current relationship with academia. It's become an uncritical megaphone for scientific claims. Because of this, unscrupulous actors have taken a leaf from the tobacco playbook. As well as manipulating the media, some now target academia directly. This is a more efficient and more effective and more subtle way to influence public opinion, as scientists are thought to be unbiased and independent. A classic example of business exploiting academics to create a media storm was the Nobel Prize winner's letter in May 2020, protesting the discontinuation of funding to the EcoHealth Alliance. As you may have heard, when Donald Trump heard that the EcoHealth Alliance, a New York-based nonprofit, was channeling US research funds to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and funding Zhengli Shi to genetically modify bat coronaviruses, he ordered the NIH to terminate that funding. Almost immediately, 77 Nobel laureates wrote a public letter to US Health Secretary Alex Azar, saying that they were, quote, gravely concerned, end quote, about the precedent set by this termination. This letter gained wide media attention. This Nobel protest letter was organized by Sir Richard Roberts. Roberts is a molecular biologist and Nobel Prize winner, but he is also a senior executive with New England Biolabs. New England Biolabs is a huge manufacturer of scientific laboratory equipment and reagents. Cutting funds for biotech virus research threatens their core business, raising the question of whether Roberts is a disinterested party. All the signs suggest he is not. In 2016, Roberts coordinated a different Nobelist letter that also grabbed headlines. This one was a 107 Nobelist broadside aimed at Greenpeace for supposedly blocking the development and approval of GMO golden rice. I say supposedly because the central claim of the Nobel letter was false. Regardless, to publicize that letter, a press conference was organized at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. One of the organizers of that press event was a former Monsanto PR executive, and the website set up to host the letter could be traced back to the Genetic Literacy Project, another organization closely tied to the biotech industry. The point here is that there is nothing spontaneous about these letters. They're carefully choreographed PR gambits. Overtly, they are defenses of freedom of inquiry or companies, or progress, rather, sorry. But what is really being defended are the overlapping business interests of companies like New England Biolabs and Monsanto. In this world, science and scientists are useful pawns with which to shape public opinion. One might say that science has become the new public relations. The COVID-19 pandemic and the 2014 Ebola outbreak have much in common. Both outbreaks featured widespread concerns that the virus responsible might have come from a lab. Moreover, as noted above, financial support for much of the bat coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology came from the US government via a US nonprofit, in this case the EcoHealth Alliance, which is based in New York City. Over the last 8 years, the EcoHealth Alliance, whose New York head office is pictured in the slide, has received well over $100 million in federal funds. This money enabled laboratories on various continents to collect and research exotic and often highly virulent viruses. The WIV was just one such site. But the WIV and the EcoHealth Alliance work closely together. Dozens of coronavirus papers feature researchers from both institutions. Despite this conflict, Peter Daszak, the president of the EcoHealth Alliance, who is pictured here, has been allowed to exert enormous influence via the media, dismissing lab origin possibilities and talking up zoonotic theories. A second similarity is that, like the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium's funding, the budget of the EcoHealth Alliance is heavily dependent on the US Defense Department. Since 2013, the EcoHealth Alliance has received almost $40 million worth of Defense Department money. In fact, the connections between the EcoHealth Alliance and the defense sector are extensive. EcoHealth Alliance staff collaborate with defense researchers, and one of the EcoHealth Alliance's policy advisors is David Franz. Franz is listed on their website only as the principal of an entity called SBD Global, but he is the former head of Fort Detrick, the US's primary biodefense facility. When suggestions of a possible lab escape in Wuhan began to appear, the EcoHealth Alliance also turned to scientists to defend them. The first clear manifestation of this was a letter to the medical journal The Lancet in February. Calling their letter a statement, it was signed by 27, quote, public health scientists, close quote. It states, open quotes, we stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumors, and prejudice, close quote. It has since come to light through Freedom of Information requests by the transparency group US Right to Know that the orchestrator of this influential letter was Peter Daszak. Of these 27 initial signatories, only Daszak lists any affiliation with the EcoHealth Alliance. But a little digging reveals that 5 other signatories, Rita Colwell, Hume Field, James Hughes, William B. Koresh, and John McKenzie, are members of the board of directors or policy advisors or employees of the EcoHealth Alliance. William Koresh, for example, is listed as Executive Vice President for Health and Policy. All a casual reader of the letter would see is that Hume Field is from the University of Queensland, William Koresh is with the OIE, which is the UN's International Organization for Animal Health, and John McKenzie is at Curtin University, Australia. A little more digging shows that these addresses are flags of convenience. Field is an honorary professor, McKenzie is an adjunct, and Koresh is on a working group of the OIE. To conceal 5 of 6 EcoHealth Alliance affiliations, plus long-term funding arrangements with the WIB, is grossly misleading. Nevertheless, the Lancet letter ends, we declare no competing interests. Particularly important for the public understanding of the origins has been a letter published in Nature Medicine in March with the title, The Proximal Origin singular, of SARS-CoV-2. This is the text typically cited for raising the no longer credible pangolin theory that I discussed in the first talk. The letter is short, but it emphatically dismisses the possibility of a lab origin no less than 5 times. For your convenience, I've assembled those statements on this slide, but the letter also makes a straw man of the origin possibility, the lab origin possibility, rather. By construing it in specific and unnecessary ways, the authors make it easy to dismiss. This disregards that there are many ways to create a novel virus, including those that leave no sign of lab manipulation. Thus, the letter is more of a rhetorical trick than a serious work of science. The trick was highly successful, however. The proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 now has almost 2,600 citations and has exerted a vast influence on the media if explicit references to it are any measure. A notable feature of this letter, from our point of view, is that its lead author is Kevin Anderson of Scripps Research Institute, and its senior last author is Bob Gary of Tulane University. Both men are leaders of the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. These 2 scientific publications in particular have placed tremendous barriers in the way of open and rational debate about the origins of the virus. Their dogmatic and aggressive statements, conceived at a time when there was very little evidence in either direction, put pressure on scientists to dismiss lab origin theories or risk being labeled conspiracy theorists. It is important, therefore, to understand that there is an implied threat in these publications. This threat, since it is delivered from top-ranking journals, infers the blessing of the wider scientific community. The declaration of no competing interests found at the end of the Lancet letter is quite wrong, even for those who don't work at the EcoHealth Alliance. Virtually every signatory is engaged in research comparable to that going on at the WIV. That is, isolating, culturing, and experimenting with live viral pathogens and making patented vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostic tools, and other patented pandemic products. Zhengli Shi at the WIV, for example, tested the effectiveness of chemical disinfectants on coronaviruses using live virus cultures. Hence, were the WIV to be implicated in causing the pandemic, all the research of these scientists would likely come under severe scrutiny. Much harder questions would follow about the risks and rewards of the entire domain of molecular genetic work on live viruses. Thus, the Lancet letter is accurate when it states, "We are all in this together." This togetherness does not just encompass academic virologists. Academia is simply one among many institutions that thrive on pandemic preparedness and pandemic prevention. For example, the EcoHealth Alliance has business partners, shown in this slide. They include Colgate-Palmolive, Reckitt Benckiser, Johnson & Johnson, Boehringer Ingelheim, and many others. These are huge international conglomerates who manufacture either medical and research reagents or cleaning and personal hygiene products. What I earlier referred to as the pandemic virus industrial complex is thus a huge diversity of loosely allied activities and interests that span many viruses, many research projects, many companies, large and small, and many medical-related technologies. What unites this complex, apart from its subject matter, is a commercial philosophy. It is opposed to the public sector leading in healthcare provision. It is therefore capitalist, proprietary, and neoliberal. This is certainly not to say that any part of it spurns government money. In fact, capturing government funds is a primary goal, but it is to say that its basic premise is a commercial model. The person in the public sector who embodies the market-based approach to healthcare more than anyone else is, of course, Bill Gates and his foundation. It is thanks to the Gates Foundation that one could buy Ebola bonds, which are one of a number of attempts to financialize pandemics. I will say more about this in a minute. What complicates this simple view of the pandemic virus industrial complex, however, is that the military is often the provider of that government money, and its agenda is somewhat different. The military has what is sometimes called a securitization agenda. Pathogens are to be viewed not as medical emergencies, but as existential national threats. Commentators mostly agree that this securitization agenda is at bottom a framing designed to secure more funds from central governments. But it is a political agenda and not a capitalist one. The two agendas, the financialization agenda and the securitization agenda, for the most part, mingle comfortably. But in order to disentangle the affairs of the pandemic virus industrial complex, it is helpful and important to recognize the distinct influences of both. This is how it comes to be, for example, that both the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium and the EcoHealth Alliance both benefit from military funding and civil funding. The more complex of these agendas is the financialization one. The most helpful framework for understanding it is to consider that two very different, distinct models for providing healthcare exist in the world today. At one extreme, there are the government-run, free at the point of use systems traditionally represented by Britain's National Health Service or Cuba's health system. At the other extreme is the US model with its pay-to-play monetized insurance schemes. The health ideal of the first is prevention. The fewer people who go to the doctor, and the fewer of those who go to hospital, and the less time they spend there, the easier it is for taxpayers to fund. The ideal of the second, as anyone who has studied the US system will tell you, is to maximize the delivery of expensive care and prescription drugs on the assumption that this will deliver health. In short, one is the ounce of prevention system and the other is the pound of cure system. Thus, the US system thrives on expensive treatments, and these expensive treatments offer a business model for innovators, which is where the research community factors in. Research provides the ideas and intellectual property ownership through patents necessary for the system to work. The two systems approach pandemics from very different points of view. There is, in principle, a simple way to defend against respiratory disease and other pandemics. Have a healthy, informed population, offer free testing, use public service messaging, and make masks and PPE and hygiene products widely available. Importantly, this approach requires no deep knowledge of the underlying disease, which, since a pandemic is likely to be caused by a novel pathogen, it assumes is not available. This approach might be called traditional Western healthcare. The contrasting system is narrow and highly targeted. It aims to develop disease-specific diagnostics, vaccines, and cures, often devised only after the disease breaks out. Allied to this approach is the idea of pandemic disease prediction. Sample animals from the wild, collect their viruses, identify potential spillover genomes and vectors, and so predict outbreaks before they arise. To some extent, these descriptions are caricatures. No existing system fully matches them. But the key to understanding the pandemic virus industrial complex is that the latter approach is its ideal. In contrast, the appeal of PPE and prevention is negligible. It is not clear where large profits will come from. In many ways, the current pandemic represents a battle between these two. Traditional healthcare systems on one side and the pandemic virus industrial complex on the other. This is where the Gates Foundation comes in. The end goal of the Gates Foundation is to bring the US-type privatized healthcare model to the whole world and thereby save it. The foundation aims to transition all healthcare away from traditional government-led systems by creating markets for technocratic patented solutions. As Bill Gates once told the Davos World Economic Forum, businessmen and businesses are best placed to save the world. This agenda is not hidden. It can be defined from many sources, even though the foundation is quite secretive and non-transparent. For example, senior state staff at the Gates Foundation overwhelmingly come from businesses like the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry. They do not come from Greenpeace or NSO. Such business-minded people view traditional healthcare as an obstacle, and they see no conflict in Bill Gates promoting vaccines and also investing in vaccine manufacturers. To them, this is simple synergy. One key reason why the Gates Foundation is successful, therefore, is simply that it is perfectly in sync with the activities of the pandemic virus industrial complex. The other reason is that the Gates Foundation is exceedingly strategic and clever in implementing this vision. Thus, the Gates Foundation has dual roles, visionary and fixer. The Gates Foundation has vast financial resources and unsurpassed connections. It also has the freedom to operate conferred by its unaccountable foundation status. The Gates Foundation can therefore do almost whatever it wants. It uses this power in strategic and sometimes unexpected ways. Its strategy has two main arms. One is the obvious one of leveraging its money. The foundation is very wealthy, but it also spends its money very carefully. It strategically sprinkles it around so as to incentivize others to work towards its chosen goals. It also attaches a lot of strings to the money that it does give, and it leverages that money to generate more for the institutions and projects that it favors. If organizations already exist and cannot be unmade, they are co-opted or a workaround is formulated. If suitable organizations do not exist, the Gates Foundation creates them. All these characteristics create a pervasive web of influence and an environment of deference and stifling conformity. One could say a culture of fear, which is sometimes described as the Bill chill. The activities of the Gates Foundation are thus at least as much about achieving institutional structures as about practical achievements. And the aim, to quote Nicoletta Dentico, is to generate, open quotes, financial pressure aimed at directing international political consensus towards technical solutions, close quote. Hence, the Gates Foundation is a funder of both the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium and the EcoHealth Alliance, because these institutions are considered to be advancing important technical goals of the pandemic virus industrial complex. A classic example of the Gates approach is Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. Gavi exists to develop global vaccination programs. The Gates Foundation set it up, strategically located its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, near to the World Health Organization, and has provided it with $4.1 billion. Added to this sum has been $14 billion provided by Northern government donors. Gavi operates on a public-private partnership model. Despite this large cash input, local countries still have to pay Big Pharma for the vaccine and must also contribute staff and infrastructure for the resulting vaccination programs. Gavi is estimated to have saved 13 million lives. But it is also clear that in many countries, its programs have come at the expense of very basic healthcare. To many analysts, it is unclear if there are any ultimate public benefit deriving from Gavi. However, there is a private profit, and there is a benefit to the Gates Foundation. It gets the lion's share of the credit without ultimately having put up much of the money. This is the classic Gates Foundation pattern. On the back of taxpayer dollars, the already powerful institutional partners emerge on the credit side, whereas weak institutions and the supposed beneficiaries are left with little, and sometimes with considerably worse outcomes even than that. But the Gates Foundation also spends a significant proportion of its money on shaping public opinion in favor of its staff, its programs, and its objectives. I once went to a talk at Cornell given by a dean in the College of Agriculture. Cornell had just been awarded a grant from the Gates Foundation. The dean was pleased, but also taken aback to find out that the terms of the grant required them to spend 10% of the money on publicity. The next time you see a newspaper or magazine article featuring a Gates-funded project, consider the likelihood that it was paid for. An investigation in late 2020 by Tim Schwab of the Columbia Review of Journalism found that the Gates Foundation had disbursed at least $250 million to the media. At the UK's Guardian newspaper, for example, the Gates Foundation sponsors its coverage of international development. $250 million is a large sum, but Schwab's investigation did not cover grants like the one offered to Cornell, nor did it cover contracts entered into by the foundation. Nevertheless, as Schwab showed, such spending goes a long way to explaining the extraordinary level of media interest in the Gates Foundation. The glowing editorials, the multitude of Gates interviews, and of course the rarity of critical coverage. The resulting positive attention protects and advances Gatesian agendas and creates a broad political license to operate. Returning to the case of COVID-19, it might now be clearer how all this plays out in the pandemic. On the one hand, the Gates approach, as modeled by the US, has not been a clear success. Even though the US has nominally a very high standard of healthcare, the virus has spread out of control. For many, the best hope lies with vaccines, but for now, it is too early to determine what their effects will be. On the other side, traditional public health measures, such as masks and PPE and hospital beds, have been sorely needed but in short supply. Shortages of these have severely impacted the progress of the pandemic, as evidenced by examples such as the disastrous decisions to move COVID patients to nursing homes. So one cannot yet say that the Gates approach has been a success. Inasmuch as the data is in, it has arguably failed. That is to say, no one predicted the pandemic, even though the virus emerged under the noses of its pandemic prediction researchers in Wuhan. And the success of virus testing has been very mixed. Tests were slow to roll out, sometimes slow to deliver results, and often of questionable reliability. And insofar as the origins of the virus are concerned, the question is even more fraught. If the virus escaped from the web, we can ask the question, what experiment was in progress that led to it? Were they making a vaccine? Were they testing a pharmaceutical? Were they conducting research to prevent future pandemics? Unless they were making a bioweapon, which I don't think is likely, then the answer is one of these. If it is ever established that a lab escape caused the pandemic, then it would be a severe blow to the Gates approach to public health. We should not be surprised then to see the core constituents of the pandemic virus industrial complex, i.e. the medical profession, the pharmaceutical industry, the scientific establishment, and their allies in the media, try to suppress public discussion of lab escapes. We should not be surprised, since the Gates Foundation is the World Health Organization's biggest donor, to see on their flagship committee investigating the pandemic's origins, Peter Daszak and Fabian Linders. The Gates Foundation knows, as do many others, that their core goal of market-based healthcare is at stake. So thank you, everyone. And I'm happy to take questions, assuming there's still time.
And sound? Are you hearing me there?
I hear you.
Do you hear me?
I can hear you.
You guys hear me? Okay. So here's the first question that we have from Conrad. How many labs exist outside the USA that are controlled by the military?
Well, that have strong military influences. There's one in Georgia. There is a thing called the Lugar Act and Lugar centers. So Lugar centers are basically found mostly in non-communist or former communist countries. And they were basically set up as an effort to basically divert former Soviet bloc researchers into not researching pandemics or bioweapons, but rather research, turn their research to practical, useful use. So there's quite a few, but I couldn't tell you the exact number. Sorry.
A little bit on the same line, who can enter these and use them? And then also says, including the CIA. And then he says, many of them were in the old USSR. Remember, this fellow Conrad is writing a book about the coronavirus. I told you about him before.
So the question was about how many are accessed by the CIA. I think, there is evidence. There's a Bulgarian writer, and I can't remember her name offhand, but she studied the lab in Georgia. She has gone there and shown US diplomats shuttling backwards and forwards from the lab to the local airport in diplomatic vehicles, presumably taking samples back and forwards. So, there's good reasons to think that when these labs collect samples, that the US obtains copies of all these samples. You basically take a swab and you divide the sample in two. So I think that kind of thing is good evidence for, the US takes bioweapons and biosecurity, at the CIA level and the defense industry level extremely seriously. So I don't think they spurn opportunities to get involved in these kinds of institutions.
So Ty asks, does the Mojiang's miner's passage theory provide any insight into the presence of furan cleavage sites in the coronavirus associated with COVID-19?
Yeah, we would say that it does potentially. So one furan sites. When I say, the question is, why did the virus become a pathogen of the lungs, right? The reason why coronavirus is more harmful than the COVID rather is more harmful than a regular coronavirus is that it infects people's lungs and other tissues, right? Like it goes into people's nervous system. That's why people have the inability to taste, for example. It goes into people's intestines. It can go into various organs. And so that's one reason why it's such a harmful virus, or relatively speaking, harmful virus compared with most, coronaviruses. And so what the miners' passage theory basically says is that the miners got a huge dose in their lungs, and the lungs were basically the incubator. And what you need for a virus to survive well in the lungs is a furan cleavage site. So most people have focused on the evolution of the furan site in a technical sense, like what virus did it come from, or did somebody add it as part of a kind of lab manipulation process? But we also know that furin sites evolve naturally, just through mutation. And what the Mojang minus passage theory suggests is that there was such a selection pressure inside these lungs. So like the longest miner to have had the illness had it for something like 6 months, right? What that does is provide a huge selection pressure to evolve things like furin sites that enable the virus to do well in the lungs. And so what we've ended up with is a virus that's super good at infecting lungs, and that's why it's so harmful. So yeah, we would say yes, it does.
So Conrad asks this one, what's the status of the lab at Kinema Hospital, size-wise? How long has it been there? And who finances it?
Well, it's financed by U.S. Defense Department money. I mean, it was set up when the CDC categorized Lassa fever as being a potential terrorist threat. So basically, people didn't have much interest in Lassa fever virus because it was in Africa, because it was far away from us. It really didn't get much money or much attention. And so, I'm blanking on the date of that CDC designation. I think it was around 2005, but I'd have to, there's a bunch of sources that I could tell you, and I'm sorry, I've just gone and forgotten. And, I would recommend the book, the Ebola Outbreak book of Chono Bar. I think he has quite a lot of information about, who was working in that lab and what kind of facilities they had. But it's also quite secretive. It's not actually a lot of issues about what there's because the lab is separate from the hospital, right? And so the lab is the bit that's funded by the military and operates through the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium, and the hospital is somewhat different. And we know, for example, that the hospital was very under-provided. For example, when that Ebola outbreak started, they did not have any thermometers at all in the hospital. So they had very little, very few facilities. Whereas the lab, has ended up with $40 million spread over a bunch of years. So they have, they have more or less what they want.
Would you repeat again the name of the Ebola book author? It came real quick.
Yeah. Chono Bar, B-A-H. It's in the slide, actually. I'll just put up the slide. Chono Bar. He's now studying at Northwestern University.
Okay. There we go. Okay, Sinat, I apologize if I got your name wrong, asks, what is the role played by the so-called One Health paradigm in the pandemic viral industrial complex?
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of roles that I would say that it plays. I mean, one of the interesting things about the EcoHealth Alliance is, One Health, the fundamental idea of One Health, going back 20 years, is that pandemics come from the forest if you disrupt the forest. So, when people go and log, when people go and set up palm oil plantations, or if they set fire to the forest, then, you disrupt the ecology and animals emerge with virus diseases, maybe they're more sick and so forth. This was a fundamental idea. And one of the interesting things about that idea is that it opposes things like palm oil plantations and logging, right? Interference in the forest is discouraged, right? The whole point of the original idea was to show the linkages between an intact forest and a healthy ecosystem and human health, so that people would have an incentive to not damage the forest. But the EcoHealth Alliance, for example, they partner with organizations like Johnson & Johnson and I listed some of the others, Colgate Palmolive, for example. What's interesting about these organizations is that they are big palm oil users, right? So what's going on with the EcoHealth Alliance, which in many ways has adopted the mantle of One Health and claims to be speaking for One Health, is they are partnering with the organizations that are primarily responsible for destroying the forest. They have basically, instead of opposing exploitation, they have become facilitators of the exploitation of the forest. So that organization has kind of mimicked the migration of One Health. So there are basically, there are powerful parts of the One Health movement, like the EcoHealth Alliance, which is well funded. And then there are the impoverished parts of the EcoHealth Alliance, or there are individual professors who will tell you that, that the EcoHealth Alliance is on the wrong track and we should be protecting the forest. We shouldn't be giving awards to Colgate Palmolive for making slightly more sustainable palm oil plantations, which the EcoHealth Alliance has done. And so this is the complication of the One Health agenda. And what the EcoHealth Alliance has also done is facilitate this research into pandemic prediction, into pandemic prevention. So they are funding, because they're funding Zhengli Shi, for example, and they're funding her expeditions into remoter parts of China and other parts of Asia and even Africa to go and find viruses. They've become essentially fully paid up members of the pandemic virus industrial complex. So they're totally broken with their kind of original mission. And if it's not so obvious if you look at their website, but if you look at their activities, it's perfectly clear that they are just fully paid up members of the PVIC.
Well, the last couple we have here are a couple comments from Conrad. One is, I have a map. I think he says it a little differently, but I have a map from a Bulgarian, from that woman, which is, you had talked about a lady. So I think he's just making that as a comment. The second one is that MA15 infects lungs, and that was used as a backbone for one of the classic Barrick and Shi created
Yeah, no, that's
so
right.
Comments from him.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any other questions. And
I can add a little bit to Conrad's comment, though. It's not normal for coronaviruses. MA15 is an artificial coronavirus that was basically developed through passaging. And so it's not very representative of standard human coronaviruses. But most human coronaviruses are they basically infect the nasal passage and the upper respiratory tract. And so that is something that needs to be explained about this pandemic. So that's one reason why I cited that at the beginning as a reason why we favor the Mojang minus passage theory, why we presented that.
Right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for these last 3 weeks. Lots of interest here, and everybody in the audience, thank you for being patient and I don't think any of you left during the whole time. That was very cool. Mark and Arif, thank you for your help. And we actually are going to hope that sometime down the road we get Jonathan back to talk about his real expertise, which is DNA, and where he has a huge love and passion. And we've talked about it, and we'll get him to potentially do a series for us down the road on that. Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah, no, you're welcome, Wayne. Thanks very much, and thanks very much to the audience and for the questions. That was great. Yeah, I'd love to be back. Yeah, I didn't really plan to plug it, but I'm writing a book about genetic determinism and how organisms are really self-organizing systems and what that means for biology, but also politics and many other things.
Awesome. Well, Mark, why don't you take us out? Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend, and thank you for being here.